Hey everyone, Pastor George here for Apologetics Wednesdays, and today I want to talk about science. So I talked a little bit about science in my last two videos, but I feel like we should talk about it more because it seems to be an interesting topic for some of you, and also it's usually one of the things that we have to grapple with the most, right? I mean, anyone who's talked to anyone about anything religious, you're always going to run into like, well, that doesn't seem possible, or that's not scientific, or something like that. And so I want to talk about just science in general, and I'm going to talk about it hopefully in a way that's helpful for you guys and equips you to talk to people about these things. So, first of all, we all know what science is, most of us anyway. When you go through school, you have to take science class. I was not very good at science. It was better. I liked it way more than math, which was my least favorite subject, but I was not very good at it. I find it extremely interesting, though, as many people do. And so, but we learned the scientific method, right? Hypothesis, testing, conclusion, all that type of stuff. And it's a good method. Now, one of the things that I think where people go wrong, where they praise science, is they either let it get outside of what that's testable, and we talked about that kind of last week, right? That you can't really test whether or not something's good. You can't test feeling, right? These are things that science can't really deal with. This is more for philosophy. But another thing where science can be impacted by, and it is impacted by, is humanity, right? That humans ourselves can impact scientific outcomes. Now, science, when it's done well, this doesn't happen, right? But when science is exposed to humans, that is a variable that it can't really account for, and so they can insert their own bias into things. Now, this is not to say that scientists are not trustworthy. They are, all right? I have friends that are scientists or work in science fields. They are very trustworthy. But the point is that everyone can get swept up in the era of the age. And last week I talked about a guy named Gould, maybe you'll remember, and he wrote this one book about how you can't do science and religion together. You can't let one overtake the other because they're trying to solve two different problems. He also wrote this wonderful book called The Mismeasure of Man. And in The Mismeasure of Man, he talks about how science at one point was so centered and so unanimously agreed on one topic that they ended up doing some pretty horrible things with that. So at the beginning of the 20th century, for those of you who don't know, there was something that has now been coined as scientific racism, where scientists would say things like, well, white people's skulls are larger, which means that they have bigger brains, right? And all of this was built on Darwinian evolutionary theory. And so this led to all sorts of things like eugenic thought, which is where you don't let certain people breed, miscegenation, like don't let races intermix. And it ultimately led, I believe, to a large part of the science that drove such terrible things like the Holocaust. And all that came about because they all were infected by their culture, and their culture infected their science, right? And these were all top names in their fields. It's not like this was some small movement. And it's not to say that they're not good scientists outside of those things. Many of them, I'm sure, were fine. But it just goes to show that these things are where we are raised and what culture we're brought up in can greatly affect how things turn out. And science is no different than this. The church is no different than this either. I do not want to posit that the church is immune from this. Many times the church has failed in this area as well. And so we need to have, obviously, humility when we come into these topics. But I think one of the things that we need to discuss is that, science is important, but science isn't the be-all, end-all, and science is just as open to be tampered with as anything else. I'm sure there are things we believe right now, scientifically, and I'm not talking about like Big Bang or evolutionary theory in particular. I'm just talking about some things maybe we take for granted or something we trust scientists on that in the next 20, 30 years is going to be proven wrong. Hopefully, it's not something with such terrible consequences as the previous things. But that's why this, again, kind of ties in. And that's why we need to be careful in general when we use science, but especially we need to be careful about it when we speak about moral things. And that's why we as Christians rely on the Bible so much, because the only place for us to get our moral teaching is from God. I think that's the best argument for the existence of God, is just that you can't really have any sort of these feelings about what is good or wrong or evil or right or wrong without there being some deity in the world. So that's just what I wanted to say about science today. I hope it was interesting to you, and I will see you tomorrow for Culture Thursdays. So I will see you then.